Before we dive into the pecs, first, there's this, because we can work together to create a healthier world, and in the meantime, keep smiling. The pectoralis major muscle is an entity into itself. It is the muscle that is responsible for both punching and hugging. It is easy to work on with men and difficult to work on with women. It is its own antagonist as it both flexes and extends the humerus, and on top of that, holds trigger points that can often mimic heart attack pain. So learning how to work with the pecs can be one of your best tools. I'm starting by warming up the superficial tissues of the upper fibers of the pectoralis major muscle for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the safest approach to initiate your work, especially if you have a female client. And number two, there is a direct correlation between tension in the pecs and the tension that is felt in the shoulders and the neck. So you want to connect all of that first. With a broad flat palm, I'm hooking into the fascia that reaches down from the neck into the shoulder and into the pecs while using my right hand to hook in and pull up superiorly. This is going to initiate some opening up and some nice blood flow. I usually do stand on the same side of the table that I'm working towards with the client and then stand on the opposite side of the table for demo purposes. But in this case, I really do stand on one side of the table and work on the opposite side of the pecs that I'm focused on. Mainly because as I'm sinking down here and pushing away from the sternum, I want these fibers to start releasing their grip onto the front of the humerus and allow the shoulder to drop back down to the table. As I roll the shoulder back up to get ready for my next technique, I'm just reminding the pecs that they are allowed to soften and allowed to let go as I sink in a little bit deeper. Pulling the humerus up like this away from the table pulls the attachment sites closer together, which is a shortening of the muscle. And from here, I can apply a really easy pin and stretch. So I'm shortening the muscle, pinning it down with a soft fist, and as I let the humerus drop back down towards the table, the muscle itself is lengthening, and I'm creating a nice deep myofascial stretch. As with any other technique, there are 100 different variables that you can do to accommodate what your client might need. And so lifting and holding the pecs into a positional release might be a good option, allowing the pecs to lengthen slowly might be a good option, or using your other hand to help accentuate that final stretch and elongation of the pecs might be the thing that you need. Totally up to you, depending on your client. After some deeper work like that, the attachment site at the humerus might be feeling a little bit grippy, so take some time to use your palm to work over the insertion and allow some time for the connection from the shoulder up into the neck to ease into this new state of relaxation. I'm clearly not working with a female client for this demo, but if I were, this might be a good time to ask the client to reach over and create their own safety by holding onto the sheet and allowing themselves to feel in control. The pec major is predominantly larger with men than it is with women, but it doesn't mean that the tension and the trigger points that are buried there don't exist across the board. So working down into the upper fibers and finding common trigger points, like the one that is tucked underneath the clavicle near the coracoid process, are really important to understand how to work well. A lot of the work that I'm doing in this video is about breaking down the tension so you can find those deeper trigger points, but at any point applying trigger point therapy can be really effective. I'm spending a lot of time here releasing the connection of the pec fiber muscles onto the clavicle and finding my way down into the subclavius and then eventually around the coracoid process, which is an attachment site for the pec minor. And all of these muscles have different fiber directions and pull in different directions and therefore create the chaos that gives rise to trigger points. Remembering that the platysma hooks into the superficial fascia right here underneath the clavicle, my intention here is a deep myofascial release. Again, avoiding the coracoid process and then following along the fibers of the pec major out towards the humerus, really opening things up and repeating that intention for allowing the shoulder to drop back down. The pecs really pull the shoulder forward when they're tight and tense, which creates a downward spiral through the shoulder and the neck. So this is my primary focus. In the same way that tension in the hamstrings can create a cramp in the gastrocnemius, tension in the upper traps and the levator scapula and the neck muscles can create that similar cramping, which shows up as trigger points in the pecs. So keep this whole area connected. At this point, I've done a lot of work on the upper fibers and I want to shift to the more middle and lower fibers. And in order to do this, the best plan of attack is to pull the arm up overhead for the client. Make sure that you don't drop their arm too far down as it can pinch nerves and tissues in the back of the shoulder. And once you've created a nice support system that allows their arm to relax, you can start to work down into the different parts of this incredibly thick muscle. I'm using my knee here to bolster my client's arm, and I'm starting with an intention of using my right hand to push down on the pecs while using my left hand to pull up on the lateral and the posterior scapula and shoulder. I like to think about working with stubborn muscles in the same way that I like to think about raising stubborn kids. Sometimes you need to put your foot down and reteach them how to be, but sometimes giving them what they want tricks them into thinking they're getting their way and allows you to do the work that you need to get done. So in this instance, the pecs really want to pull the shoulders forward and down. The work that I'm doing is mimicking that action, and as the pecs start to soften up, I can start to do the work that I'm really focused on. Transitioning right from there into a pin and stretch, I'm using my left hand to bring the humerus up, which softens the pecs, and using a nice soft fist with my right hand to sink down into the tissue as I lower the elbow down to the table, lengthening the pecs out, creating a nice deep stretch. An alternative to this technique for somebody who might want a little more aggressive work is to use a grip instead of a compression during the pin and stretch. So making sure that I'm using the entirety of the side of my first finger and reaching around the fibers of the pec major, getting down to the deeper levels and even down into the pec minor, creating some deep change and reaching those more hidden and stubborn fibers. As always, be cautious of any nerve endings or lymph nodes in the axillary area. Keep the intention of the pressure of your thumb towards the rib cage, towards the pec minor, and think about unsticking the connection of the pecs from the rib cage. If your hand is getting tired, you can always use a forearm or an elbow, but if this feels too tricky, you can place your client's arm back down to their side and sink in a little bit deeper, giving your hand and your fingers a rest. While you might not have access to the lateral fibers of the pecs as you did when their arm was over their head, you can use your elbow to sink in from lateral to medial and at the same time create a nice myofascial connection over the insertion into the humerus as you slide down the arm. If they're still being stubborn, another alternative course of action is one of my constant go-tos, an active engagement technique. So for this one, I'm having my client lift his arm and holding his elbow in an L shape. In this position, I can resist that hug or that punch action that the pecs do so well. I've switched my hands from the first time I did it just to show you that it doesn't really matter which hand you use for which. Figure out what works best for you. But from here, I'm using one hand to resist that action and the other hand to sink down into those engaged fibers of the pec. And when he releases down, I'm supporting his arm as it drops to the table and using the compression into his chest to get to that depth of that newly opened up muscle. As always, after you do any intense work, make nice, connect one side of your client to the other before you move on. So that technique involved actively engaging the pecs into horizontal adduction, but that's not the only action that the pecs do, and that might not be targeting the issue that is going on for your client. So another approach might be this one. I've got my left arm under my client's forearm, and that serves as a purpose of resistance. I'm going to have my client push his arm down into my arm, creating internal rotation, and this allows me to grip into the fibers as they pull the humerus into that position. So again, actively engaging these fibers, compressing down into that activation, and then when he releases, I can sink down a little bit deeper and create a lot more fluidity. For this version, I'm using one hand to support his back and draw the connection between what's happening in the pecs and the rest of the shoulder, but I can also pinpoint my focus so that the work is more specific. In this version, I've got both hands hooked into the lateral portion of the pecs, and as he contracts into internal rotation, I'm creating a more focused pressure, and when he releases, I can manipulate the muscle to open up and allow the shoulder to fall away from the rib cage. I'm demoing this one more time, but as I do, just take note of all the other muscles that are engaging to make this action happen. The shoulder is lifting away from the table, maybe it's lifting up towards the ear, maybe the elbow is pulling down towards the rib cage. Creating an awareness around what your client is doing that is contributing towards any dysfunction is always going to be the most helpful tool you've got. Because just like all other aspects of being human, awareness is the first step towards change. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you were curious, I demoed this video on my boyfriend who I've been safely quarantined with. I hope that you guys are remaining safe and well and healthy and reemerging in ways that help our world become a better place. As always, I have a deep, heartfelt thank you extended to my Patreon supporters. If you want to check out anything else that I'm doing, I will leave links in the description below.